could be 4 hours long, and we would just be scratching the surface of all of these things that we need to talk about. So just so you know, this is definitely not a be-all, end-all, that we hope that whatever you take away from today's conversation will spark thinking and spark change, and know that this is just going to hopefully be the beginning for you. For those of you who are new to these issues, for those of you who are not new to these issues, some of this will be you know, a reimagining or a reiteration of what you already know, and hopefully a deepening. And just to say, today we're going to talk about, we're actually going to probably talk about more about artistry than about audiences, just as an FYI, just so you know that that's how we're framing the conversation. So again, my name is Christine Bruno. I'm based here in New York City. I identify as a disabled actress, cisgendered, white woman. I'm describing myself. I have short, curly brown hair. I am wearing a fuchsia short sleeve top with slacks, and I normally use a mobility scooter, which I don't have today because it's broken. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm going to pass it over to the panel to briefly introduce themselves. This is Sophia Cheyenne.
Hi, guys. I'm Sophia Cheyenne. I'm also based here in New York. I'll describe also what I'm wearing today just to help anyone else in the audience that needs it. I'm wearing a blue crochet top, leggings, rain boots, because I thought it was going to rain today, but it didn't. And I'm using a step stool to help me feel more comfortable in this chair. I'm an actor, dancer, singer, a writer, and educator. I'm also dabbling in the consulting world a little bit, disability consulting, which is really exciting. In my work, it's definitely, you know, through an advocacy lens, and I try to use my creative outlets as a way to educate people about my community, which is the dwarfism community. Yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
Hello, I am Matthew. I am the co-founder and co-director, one of the co-directors of Tourette's Hero, based in London. I am a white man in my early 40s. I often describe myself, I'm wearing glasses. I say that I have much less hair on my head than I would like to. And I'm wearing some drab clothes today. I should also say that I don't often talk on panels of this kind. I identify as being a non-disabled person. I don't often talk on panels of this kind because when I'm working with Jess Tom, who's performing Not I later on, she tends to speak much. It's much better. A lot of the conversations that we have, I feel like it's much better coming from her. So, so please understand that that's where I'm coming from when we're having this discussion. We make work for disabled and non-disabled children and young people and adults. We do theatre work, we do creative events, and we do training and education stuff. So Tourette's Hero is 10 years old this year, and we do all kinds of different things. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's it.
Hello everyone, I'm Alexandria Wales. I am New York based and I'm speaking through two sign language interpreters. Craig and Lynette will be my voice this afternoon. I will describe myself. I use the pronouns she, her. My hair is in a messy bun on the top of my head. I am wearing a sweater with a gray thin cardigan and black leggings, open-toe shoes with leopard print socks, and the obvious elephant in the room. I have a gold chain around my neck that says cool in cursive. I try to be cool. So as I said, I'm based in New York. I am an actor, dancer, ASL consultant, director of artistic sign language. I also work as an educator, and because, as I just mentioned, I wear many hats, but education is very important. We still have a ways to go in terms of getting everyone to fully understand our world. So that's a little bit about me.
Great, that's great. And I will just add by saying that I neglected to say all of the many other hats that I wear, and that's one of the things we'll talk about in today's panel, is all of us, we by necessity wear a lot of hats, I think. In addition to being an actor, I am also a teaching artist, and a disability inclusion consultant, a director, and a singer. So those are some of my hats. I think I would like to start with Matthew, talking about, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the social model of disability.
Sure. So as a company, we use the social model of disability as the kind of starting point for all the work that we make, and in very kind of broad terms, the social model says that disability isn't something that a person carries around with them. Somebody is more or less disabled by the systems, structures and attitudes of the wider society. So it's not a kind of fixed position, it's something that can change, and that means that everybody shares the responsibility to make more inclusive and accessible spaces by making small, reasonable adjustments. It's a kind of a move away from the charity model and also from the medical model that kind of underpins still a lot of the way people think about disability. I think lots of people in the disability arts community and activism community are probably very familiar with it. It's something that is critiqued and hopefully will change and evolve over time, but we think it's a very useful starting point for understanding how disability sits within culture. A very practical example would be if you're a wheelchair user, if a building has elevators or steps, if a building has elevators or a ramp, then you have full access to that building. If it has steps and no other means to get in, then you experience the barrier of that access, and therefore that is a more disabling space. So it's not with the person. Linguistically, that also means that we don't use person-first language within our company, and generally speaking, not in the UK at all as well. So that means that we talk about disabled people rather than people with disabilities. And it's a subtle difference, but it's acknowledging that people do not drag their disability around with them. We would say somebody has an impairment, which is a fact about that person, but they're more or less disabled by the environments that they are in. And it's also worth just saying that understanding the social model understanding underpins a lot of the legislation in the UK. So it's not just within a kind of activism or arts context, it's also within the kind of legal system within the UK.
So that would be, just to clarify, that's the DDA, correct? The legal.
So yeah, exactly. Yes, within the Discrimination Act,
yeah,
precisely.
So for the Americans in the audience, the UK has something called the Disability Discrimination Act. Is that?
That's one of the
right.
One of the first pieces of legislation. There are more subsequent.
And that's versus our ADA, right? Our Americans with Disabilities Act, which is much more follows the medical model of things. It talks about physical access to spaces and employment, and right from the very get-go with the legislation in the UK, it follows more of the social model. So is that correct?
Yeah, and that legislation only came about through activism by disabled people. So it wasn't something that was just laid out by non-disabled people for disabled people, perfect straight away. It was born out of a lot of kind of hard-won equalities and struggle in the UK. So it's reflective of activism, disability activism.
So that leads into my next question about arts and disability arts. Could you explain the term, how you see the definition of the term disability arts, and how that manifests itself in the UK.
So I guess within the UK, we think about the kind of disability art scene as being an extraordinarily kind of rich and dynamic scene that is involves kind of lots of disabled artists making work that speaks to their experiences. That I think Jess often kind of describes it as a club that once you kind of find out about it and you're kind of welcomed into that world, you're welcomed into a world that is much richer and more dynamic and more interesting, arguably speaking, than kind of mainstream arts and culture. So it kind of, we think that that's like, the work that's made within the disability art scene is just, generally speaking, is just better work. It's more interesting, and it's something that non-disabled people are welcome into, but it's a world that is kind of supportive of pan impairment, so for disabled people of all kinds, and also that it's kind of inherently a political act. So it's about being visible, it's about sharing solidarity and support, and it's about making sure that those spaces remain occupied by disabled people, and so that culture evolves and continues. And I think that's something that we came into at a particular point, and there were older disabled artists like Matt Fraser and Liz Carr who kind of showed us what was possible within that world, and that as a result, because Jess and I have worked with disabled and non-disabled children for 20 years, we're also then very concerned with how that scene, how disability arts and culture is shared with a younger generation of disabled, young, talented performers, so that it's something that continues, because it's always under threat of being sidelined, I think.
Right. And I want to add Alexandria and Sophia into this conversation, and then talk about funding for a second. How do you, Sophia and Alexandria, see the disability arts as it exists in the U.S., or if it does exist in the U.S.? In what way? What are the similarities of the disability arts as Matthew has described them in the UK versus how they manifest themselves here in the US?
Would you like to take that?
Well, I think we definitely all agree on this, but I for sure see, and my experience has been that in the US there's more of a visual art, or in dance companies is sort of where we see the disabled artists thrive or have more opportunity, whereas in comparison, TV and theater have a little more trouble, bringing the disabled artists into that medium. And in my experience, I feel that I've had more experience with dance companies. It seems to me like it's an easier thing. I mean, I'm a dancer and I love dancing, and I express myself that way, and I love doing that. But it feels like it's an easier way for the audience to see disability and experience disability than to possibly, lean into a story and really lean into a narrative about a disabled person.
Alexandria?
Yes, I agree with Sophia. I think here in the States, visual arts and dance really have surpassed film and television work. I grew up as a dancer, and I didn't have to worry about speaking on stage or hearing. I am deaf, so those were not obstacles to me. And it was, to me, a political statement, just my body being on that stage and moving freely through dance. As I've grown up, and now as an adult, I have become aware of more diversity in the community. And in theater, film, and television, we are so far behind in terms of representation of that diversity. I think it's because the medical model persists here in the States, and we see people with disabilities and think, oh, that poor thing. So I can automatically see people calculating how expensive it's going to be to work with me. And that's not a helpful conversation to engage in. And it's not helpful for me as an artist to be on the receiving end of that. I'm hungry. I want to contribute to the artistic world, but to be automatically pigeonholed that way is troubling. I know a lot of that is capitalism in the US, right? That's the dominant structure that we are all in service of here. And so the cheapest thing and the most successful idea wins. And so that's why I think in film and theater, in those spaces, those buildings, the buildings where those happen are typically older buildings that have fewer accommodations built into them. And so in terms of the community that's welcome there, it's more limited. When we talk about people who are deaf, people who are blind, people, and any disabled person, the requirements that you put on those spaces automatically become more expensive. And I get it, it's a reality. However, at the same time, that ongoing struggle, that ongoing pushback is challenging. And I'm very fortunate. I have worked with so many fantastic artists, so many fantastic organizations and groups of progressive thinkers who have calculated and figured out ways to be ready, to budget, to have a line in their budget, to do what it takes to make good art happen. And that pre-planning is essential so that I, as an artist, can get there and focus on just making the art. I don't have to focus as much on doing the educational work because it's laborious. If I can focus on the art itself, I feel so much more enriched. It's such a better experience.
That's a perfect segue into talking about funding and the funding differences between the UK funding schemes and the funding schemes in the US. So, Matthew, can you talk a little bit about that, about the funding and the conversation we were having before the panel was about risk.
Sure.
And I think that's a really important thing to talk about here in this room because we don't often talk about the realities of risk-averse funding schemes.
Yeah, I will, absolutely. One of the things that what Alexandria just said also sparked in my mind, which Jess, at any opportunity, gets very excited about to talk in a kind of international context, is access to work, which is a government scheme that means that disabled people in employment get they are able to receive money in order to be able to do their job without any additional cost to the employer. So it means that as long as, and the scheme's not perfect, and it again is kind of subject to the cuts that are happening more generally, but the idea of that is that it removes a barrier to access in any kind of work context. So that might be equipment, or that might be translators, or it might be anything that means that that disabled person is able to do the job that they are doing without additional cost to the employer. And that works within the arts context as well as anywhere else. So that is if you're an artist. In terms of risk, I think that one of the things with the UK arts funding, and particularly with the Arts Council, I guess, is that there has been a traditional willingness to take risks around work, to be able to create work that isn't entirely focused on being commercially successful. So, and for work to fail and for it not to be perfect. And I think that that has also translated into what disabled artists are able to do, and that means that you have a much better chance of being an artist at an early stage in your career, because there is that catch-22 where unless you're an established artist, you're not likely to get funding, and if you don't get funding, you can't establish yourself as an artist. So that risk is very, very significant in that. And I think we've speculated sometimes about this country, about it seems like a lot of visible disability on stage relates to dance. And I think we've sometimes wondered whether that's because obviously dance can be political and it can have a very strong message, but it doesn't necessarily carry the same narrative as other forms of expression, and that I think that we've noticed maybe that there's a tendency to make slightly more kind of polite work here, or that's the work that's easier to get funded. And I guess in terms of disability arts, that means that there is a view of making work for non-disabled people that doesn't offend them or doesn't disrupt their concepts of themselves in their society or disabled people. And I think we have been very fortunate in that we've been able to make work that doesn't assume it's for a non-disabled audience, that is attempting to only communicate outwardly an experience of what the systemic oppression of having an impairment, being a disabled person, feels like. We've been able to work in spaces that are kind of deliberately majority disabled spaces that mean that the conversation is completely different, and that's a kind of radical position to be able to take. All of those things are only possible because funders that we have worked with have been willing to take risks with us as a company and the work that we've created. And I think talking to disabled artists here, I've often felt that there's a kind of frustration around how that process works here as opposed to the UK, and lots of artists, disabled artists, coming to the UK in order to be able to move forward and do the work that they want to.
Right. And I think there are a few, but much fewer, I think, funding schemes specifically for disabled artists, right, in the US than there are certainly in the UK. And I don't know as much about, even though I've worked there, Australia, but other countries. But I think increasingly funders are looking at specific funding pools of money to support disabled artists. But it hasn't been traditionally the traditional thing that's happened, that the pool of disabled artists has had to sort of fight for the same funding that all artists fight for, which I think has been a struggle in this country. I have a question actually that we didn't talk about in our conversation for Alexandria and Sophia. It's a thing that keeps coming up in all these conversations that I've been having, is do either of you, and Matthew, you can jump in as you like as well, do you both feel the need as artists to also wear the hat of educator specifically when you're working as an artist? Mm-hmm. So when you join a project, are you asked to also wear the educator/advocate hat?
Yes.
And how does that?
Yeah.
That's a yes. And what does that look like? And how does that? I'm always concerned with the emotional labor that it takes to sort of, split your brain in 2 or 3 or 4 pieces when you really are there for a specific purpose, and most of the time not getting paid for the other 3 hats that you're wearing.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I can say with absolute confidence that every single job that I've had up until this point, I have had to do some education in one way or another about disability as a whole, about the social model, about dwarfism, and it's very exhausting, and it's absolutely needed though in these spaces, because often when I come across, if I'm lucky enough to book a role that perhaps doesn't really talk about my height, but there's something within the script that still feels like they're trying to make a joke out of this. Like, little people are still the butt of the joke. There's still something funny about this story. There's still some sort of context around that. And I mean, when I'm lucky enough to book the role, at that point, I take that script and I try to really turn it around on them, you know. And most of the time I've had good experiences where people have been open-minded and been willing to listen and hear my side of things and say, oh, you know what, she's not funny, she's sexy, you know, or she's this. And so I definitely feel like I'm wearing those hats all the time. And I don't really actually know any other way to work, to be quite honest, at this point.
Alexandria?
Yeah.
I definitely agree with Sophia. It's a very common experience for me. I find that often I spend so much time educating the people I'm working with, and I know that it's not constantly in their periphery. It's not part of their daily life. It's not part of their daily practice. This isn't an interaction they experience every day. If it's not, it's easy for them to forget. You know, if those people aren't in the room, they're not thinking about those people. So during an 8-hour rehearsal day, I have to remind people maybe 4 or 5 times during the course of the day, because they just forget. They look away from me when they're talking. They're not used to working with somebody who's deaf, and they're focused on the work. They're focused on the process. So how do we do the work, go through the process, and still be mindful of all of these things? It's definitely not easy. It takes a lot of mental effort. And I have other jobs to do, but if I don't do it, who else will do it? I have to advocate for myself. I have to hope that whatever that experience is happening in the room will broaden their minds moving forward, and I'll be working with these people as future collaborators. We need to be working together as a team. We are a team of 8 actors. We don't just say, okay, well, we have one disabled actor and that's enough, one token person, that's enough. Why can't the cast be split? Why can't it be half and half? Why can't there be people on the creative team on the other side of the table who have disabilities? Until we have people with disabilities in every station on a production, we won't really have a fully accessible experience. We need to think outside of the box and really challenge some of these notions that we have. And there will be mistakes made. And having the humility to admit when we make mistakes, and part of my French, having the humility to fuck up, if we don't have that, there isn't a way that we can push forward and improve. How do we make mistakes not about you and your mistake, but about something for the room to learn from? As an artist, I often find myself singled out. I often find myself being pointed to and having somebody say, oh, we need to make this accommodation for her. We need to do this for Alexandria or for the interpreter. Instead, can we change the conversation and make it about adjustments we can all make to work together more successfully? Why don't we use the language like, we need this to make this production happen? It's something that we need. It's not something that one particular person in the ensemble needs. I think it's a subtle difference. It's a subtle way of meeting people halfway. Mm-hmm. If you want me to show up and do all of the work, I'm happy to do it, but meet me halfway. Help me help you, help yourselves to make this adjustment in the way that you think. You come in with your ideas and your understanding, but I'm here in real time now. Mm-hmm. So we need to be more present and more assertive and really push ourselves, challenge ourselves. And of course, I've been in many rehearsal rooms and many projects, as we all have, where the people at the top are already wearing a million hats and dealing with so many different challenges. And honestly, probably as the disabled person in the room, I'm dealing with just as many things and wearing just as many hats. We have more in common than you think. We have to be able to find solutions that work and do that together. I think it's so critically important that we have a diversity of perspectives in these conversations, especially on creative teams. We can't have all white cisgender identifying folks making the decisions. Ivy League grads can't decide for everyone what the world is going to look like. I mean, I'm just using a few examples, singling out a few identities, but those identities aren't reflective of the world that we see. I mean, I'm looking around at this room. It's a pretty diverse room. So we need to honor those lived experiences in our stories. And if you don't have the knowledge to do that, what can you do to bring that into the room without depending entirely on the artist to hold your hands and educate and coddle you? Because we have jobs to do as well.
There's so much to unpack there. And before I forget, as all these things are falling out of my brain, hopefully they will fall out of my mouth correctly. You said something, Alexandria, about the humility to fuck up. Also, we have to be given the ability to fuck up. One of the things that, and I'm going back to what Matthew was saying about being this country is very risk averse. So if Alexandria or Sophia or I are involved in a production and it's a risk for that particular theater company, right, or whatever project it is, and it fails, it's put on us as the disabled person as the reason why it failed. Right? Oh, so we're not going to do that again. And that actually applies to every underrepresented community. Oh, we tried that with a trans actress, or we tried that with a black writer. That didn't work. So we're going to go back to what we know works, which was the Eurocentric, non-disabled, cisgendered white dude, right? But the non-disabled cisgender white dude, the non-disabled cisgender white dudes are the only ones who are allowed to fail and keep working. Like, the onus is so much put on us, the underrepresented community, to if what we do right out of the gate is not successful, we don't get another chance. So we're actually going into the room with that understanding as well. And as actors, I know I felt this. If I go into a room, particularly if I'm asked to audition for a non-disability specific role, I already feel automatically an obligation that I have to be better than every other person that comes into that room because I'm being judged. Oh, she wasn't good, and that's because she's disabled. And so we're not going to call these disabled people in anymore because they're not up to our standards, right? They don't have that Ivy League education. They don't have the pedigree, right? And that's because of lack of access to opportunity most of the time. I have two other things that I would love the three of you to answer quickly based on some stuff that Alexandria said. Do you feel like in some sense when you're going into these rooms that you are enabling? Are you enabling in some sense by agreeing to educate without being properly compensated, or making it clear that this is a separate hat that you're wearing? Are we as disabled artists enabling those people to continue the practice of tapping our emotional resources? Matthew, I'm guessing that you and Jess don't have this as much because you've set up. Your structure is set up that you're not doing that because, like you said, your work is being made primarily for disabled audiences, and you're sort of not tailoring the work toward a non-disabled audience. Not that they're not welcome.
Yeah, I think that, it's definitely true to say that the spaces that we perform our work are majority non-disabled spaces, and I think that we do various different things within that context to give those venues the best opportunity not to fail and to provide us with the best support that is necessary. So we quite often look at our work as being like a Trojan horse. So if a venue agrees to take some of our work, then that kind of comes with a whole range of conditions attached to it that mean that we're expecting a high standard from that venue. On a very practical level, that would start with an access rider. So Jess has information about what she is going to require in order to be able to perform any work, and that's just about how the space is laid out. And some of that is then educative in itself, where we don't have to do it because it's written down, so it's not something that we have to keep rehashing with that venue. We also, when we're working particularly with disabled children and young people, and people who generally feel excluded from those kind of public spaces, we will expect and offer to do training, which we put as a kind of add-on to the work that we're doing. So it kind of comes in addition, and that we have that very strong interest in making subtle but lasting systemic change in the places that we go. So you know, being here at BRIC for this production, there is a chill out space across the way for people if it's overwhelming being in this space during the performance. There's a space to go, and that I think is something that is relatively new to BRIC, but hopefully is learning that will mean, you know, there are opportunities to maintain those things. And I guess also that we would say that access is never something that you can achieve. It's an ongoing process, which is that same idea of kind of fucking up. It's like mistakes do happen along the way, and venues do have to be willing to do that. And also, I guess that, yeah, all of the point that you were making about the real profound change isn't going to happen unless there is kind of diversity, not just on the stage or on the screen, but behind the scenes in all of the roles and at all of the levels, from artistic director onwards, because all of these like systemic issues are to do with disabled people trying to create work in a non-disabled world, and that is unnecessarily difficult because the world is not set up to accommodate those disabled people, and that lived experience has professional value, and it's the thing that is always missed when you think about non-disabled people mimicking impairments for getting Oscars. You know, there's a kind of running joke about that. That's if you want to get an Oscar, then you mimic an impairment, and everybody thinks that's great, and you get on. The thing that those non-disabled people will never, ever have experienced is the systemic oppression that goes along with the experience of impairment. So that's always completely lost. Those changes don't happen until that they happen consistently and across the board.
During our conversation earlier, you talked about the fact that disability is considered an integral part of diversity in the UK. Can you talk about that for a second, and how that actually relates to the work that you and Jess are doing in terms of your intention of doing the work, what your intention is doing the work, and how the audience may perceive that? I'm thinking about the story you told about the man in the audience who was irate. So,
yeah, I think that we're very fortunate in the UK in that disability is very much part of the fabric of the diversity conversation, and in that kind of idea of intersectionality, and I think that that's probably one of the biggest but simplest shifts that could happen in this country, is understanding that disability is part of the diversity conversation just as much as sexuality or ethnicity or gender or any of those kind of conversations around kind of identity that are so live here and are so well refined. Disability does fit entirely within that conversation, and we notice its absence when there are kind of social justice movements that talk about diversity and talk about being inclusive, and then there are no disabled voices in those conversations, which seems very strange from a kind of outsider perspective. The point that you were making about the irate man was that we, within this production of Not I, there's a conversation and question section towards the end. And if anybody asks a question that is about the interpreter role and the ASL or BSL performer role, that performer will answer first in sign language, then in spoken English. And it does something incredibly beautiful, I think, in the space, because it disrupts the primacy of spoken English, and it means that the hearing audience just have to wait just 5 minutes before they receive their information in spoken English. And we did a performance at Battersea Arts Centre, where we work a lot, who've been very supportive of our work over a number of years. And I assume non-disabled white guy in the audience was seething with rage that he had to wait 5 minutes, and he was turning to people next to him and saying, why is she speaking, why is she speaking in sign language? He absolutely couldn't understand it, and that really made my day. I just thought, I'm glad that you felt that level of discomfort for that tiny moment, and that it pierced something in your life for that moment that made you, even if it was a very confrontational way of experiencing it, made you think about your privilege in a different way.
Right. Alexandria, you look like you have something to say. Do you have something to say?
No, I'm just laughing at Matt's story. But that 5 minutes of rage that one man experienced, I mean, you expect me to sit and wait 5 minutes? Hey, buddy, I do that every day of my life. You know what I mean? So that level of rage just, anyway. But going back to the question about whether we're enabling these companies and these individuals with whom we work, I mean, it's easy to say it's a fine line between diplomacy, or it's a fine line you walk when you're doing this diplomatic work. Because, I mean, if I know the players involved, and I know that there are going to be limitations for me and for everyone if I don't do this work, I mean, I want to be myself in these rooms, or a version of myself. So I want to plant the seeds that will lead to future opportunities for myself and for others who deserve them. So sometimes I do make exceptions if I'm thinking about the bigger picture. Yeah. I think this will be very rewarding in the long run if I do a little bit of extra education or diplomatic work right now. But it's not an easy thing it's not cut and dry. I think a lot of enabling has been done by other people leading up to this point in history where I am. Mm-hmm. I think, think about other deaf artists. All of their needs are different, and they approach situations and handle them in their own ways, and have, historically. And so a lot of the assumptions that they have set up, things that have worked for them, are assumed to work for me, and I'm stuck with them. And oftentimes, I have no way of navigating through that minefield. Yeah. Sometimes I have to remove myself from a job when I reach capacity for what I can actually handle. I try my best to navigate these situations, but sometimes I think, what am I going to gain from this experience where they have already made decisions about me, for me, and they're making me a token in this situation? What do I have to benefit here? They hired me so they could check a box. Yay, we hired a deaf actor. That's great, but what do I get out of that? I mean, I've learned a lot on my journey as an artist. So what does it mean to enable people if I know that I will have more opportunities and other deaf people will have more opportunities in the future? I think now I've gotten to a point in my career where I can be a little bit more choosy about when I do that work. I don't have to appease everyone I work with. I can be more judicious and more selective when I make these decisions, because I'm human and there's only one of me. I need to conserve my energy, and I have to think about what the payoff is ultimately going to be for myself and for other disabled artists. Who is going to benefit? Is it both of us, or is it just you?
Sophia,
and that's what I have to think about when I'm looking at job opportunities.
Sophia, have you found that as well? Has there ever been something that you've turned down or you've extricated yourself from when you found that it was not going to benefit you and or the larger community?
Definitely. I've definitely had that experience. I just want to say that I echo everything that Alexandria is saying. And yes, like I pick and choose my battles in a way, you know, and try to be a good role model and an example for what it means to hire a disabled artist. But at the same time, you know, it is my career and it's what is representing me. So yeah, it really depends on the situation and the company you're working with and who you're with.
I also think it's important right now in our last few minutes. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we might be out of time, but we have about an hour before Jess's performance starts. So I'll take this opportunity to say that anybody who would like to stay and speak to us, we're going to be here if you want to stay and speak to us after. I think it's important right now to call out an expression, because we've been talking about it, but we actually haven't named it. So some of you might be familiar with the term "nothing about us without us," and we'd like to call out what we as the disabled community we've been using for the past few years, but it hasn't caught on in much wider circles, so we're just going to call it out here, is what we like to think of is the term "nothing without us," which means that we are part of every single conversation. We have a seat at every table, whether or not the conversation has anything to do with disability, whether or not the project has anything to do with disability. And that's, you know, from the bottom up, from the top down. We cannot make systemic, lasting, sustainable change if we are not in every room for